Hi everyone, welcome to this lecture. So this is the third lecture in this third of the lectures, roughly about 6 lectures in the last section of the module, which looks at nation states and nationalism. There'll also be 2 lectures next week on geopolitics, a very brief introduction to geopolitics. Just to say, for those, for the international students who will have an exam at some stage, probably in the last week of the semester, probably the Monday of the last week of the semester. I'll email you all about this in any case. Everything up to the end of this week's lectures the exam is going to be based on everything in section B and section C up to the end of this week's lectures. So you don't need to worry about geopolitics. That won't be on the international students paper. Yeah, like ultimately, by the end of this week's lectures, I think all of you will have more than enough content covered to allow you to have a good shot at the exam in January in any case. So again, a reminder, not just for the international students, but for all the students, the exam is based solely on section B of the module and section C of the module. If you can't remember what section B and section C are, we're currently in the middle of section C. You can actually see it on the Moodle page, what section A, section B, section C was. So the big assignment was based, which was 33% of the marks, was based on section A. So that part of the course has already been well and truly assessed. So yeah, the exam in January is only going to be based in the last 2/3 of the module, and basically it's going to be based on content that has all been covered by recorded lectures. So you won't need to worry too much in late December, early January, or maybe even mid-January about forgetting things from the lecture material. So you can just go back and listen to the lectures. So it's a nil wind that blows nobody any good. The reading materials, as I said before, I'll give you a long list of potential readings. Try to dip into some of the readings. And some of them are quite useful. Some of them will give you good ideas. Why is it important for the exam? Well, obviously, as I've said before, if you can draw out some relevant ideas from recommended readings into your exam answer, you're going to get more marks in the exam. The same applies to major assignments as well. It obviously doesn't apply to the short assignments, because the short online assignments, because I want those to be based on what you've heard and engaged with in the recorded lecture content. So for instance, online exercise 5, which is partly based on last week's lecture content, but also very much based on today's lecture content. Online exercise 5 should solely based on what you hear in this lecture, what you heard in the 2 lectures last week, and what you make sense of this. So over the 2 lectures last week, we talked about states, we talked about nations, we made the point that states and nations, there's obviously some degree of linkage between them, but they're not the same thing. States are bodies, entities that are responsible with controlling and administering a territorial state, the territory belonging to that state. So there's a lot of different elements, bodies, functions associated. You've got boundaries, you've got territory, you have the concept of sovereignty tied up, you've governments, you've got an administration, you've a civil service, and so on. Nations, by contrast, they're simply a group of people who have a common attachment to a particular territory, namely the national territory, and who wish to maximize their political control over that national territory. So nations are groups of people. They're very distinct from states. So please, if you don't want to lose silly marks in the exam, please don't confuse the term nation and the term states. It happens a lot in the media. Some academics also do the same, so I won't say any more about why, because it just makes my blood boil, but don't do that in the exam. Now, you might remember last week I talked about the different definitions of the state. There was a nice, easy, simple definition, and then we got into more complex definitions when we looked at Bourdieu's definition and Weber's definition. Now, Weber's definition is pretty relevant when we start to talk about the first thing we're going to talk about in today's lecture. So today's lecture, I'm going to talk about two, I'd like to say, different types of states. One of them is officially a state, the other isn't officially a state. But they're interesting to look at in terms of getting a sense of what's happening in the world today. So Weber's definition talked about the state having the monopoly over the legitimate use of violence within the state territory, physical and symbolic, ultimately meaning that only the state government, the state, is the only body that has an army, has a police force. It controls all the forces of coercion within the state territory. Now, this is where we move on to this concept of a fragile state. Now, back when I started lecturing on this, way back in the early 2000s, the common term we used back then was failed state or collapsed state. Now, we don't use that term anymore because it proved to be quite a controversial term, because if you start to refer to states as failed states, it does have political ramifications. It does suggest that, oh, this is a failed state, so the normal rule of law no longer applies to this state. And remember last week I talked about Article 2 in the United Nations Charter, which prohibits other states from intervening in the internal affairs of other member states. But with the concept of a failed state, if you can portray a state as a failed state, you're sort of suggesting that Article 2 of the United Nations Charter no longer applies to that state. It's no longer functioning as a state, so as such, anything can go. And there was an element of this, failed state terminology being used quite a lot by the United States and the United Kingdom in relation to Iraq in 2003, in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq. That it was almost like it was building up a pretext for the invasion by saying, look, Iraq isn't actually a fully functioning state, it's a failed state. Normal rules of law no longer apply, so hence we think we're justified in this action. So yeah, we now refer to these states as fragile states. So what is a fragile state? It's generally a state where the central government has very little control over large parts of the state territory. Usually the state government might control the capital city, territory around the capital city, but the further and further you move away from the capital city, the impact of the state or the influence of the state and the government becomes less and less apparent. In a lot of the cases here, the state may have lost the monopoly over the legitimate use of physical force within the state borders. So there will be parts of the state territory where other warring groups, other warring factions actually control that territory and not the state's government. In some cases, the state may have nominal military control over the state territory, but the government of the state is just too weak to be able to extend its reach and impact to all parts of the state. So there'll be parts of the state where you'll see little or no evidence of the state government in action there. And this is the case with some very, very large states, particularly in the developing world or the global south, where there's parts of the state where the government of the state just doesn't have the personnel or resources to be able to have any impact in those areas. Now, the Fund for Peace produces what they call the Fragile States Index. It was formerly the Failed States Index. They produce a Fragile States Index every year, which ranks every state across the world, going from the states that they consider to be the most fragile or the most at risk, all the way down to the states that they consider to be the most stable. And you can get information on the Fragile States Index if you check their website, and the website address is linked there. The Fragile States Index is based on a mixture of quantitative data and qualitative data, and it captures a number of different factors, 12 different factors. So some to do with social cohesion, some political factors, some social factors, and some economic factors. Some of the more significant ones are state legitimacy. To what extent is the state's right to govern the state accepted all across the state territory? In some states, such as the Republic of Ireland, this isn't an issue. In other states, including some European states, there will be parts of the state territory where a large number of people do not believe the state has a right to govern them, and a large number of those people would prefer if they could just break away and form their own independent state. So this is a quite common element or factor associated with fragile states. But you also get a certain degree of this associated with some more states in the global north, in states in Western Europe and parts of the Western world. And that's why when we look at this Fragile States Index later on, you'll see certain states like Ireland ranking very, very favorably. Ireland, Norway, Finland, Iceland, Canada, some states like that ranking very favorably in terms of their level of state stability or the lack of fragility. Other European states rank a bit lower. So the United Kingdom, for instance, ranks a bit lower. And you can probably, I won't give you the answer yet, but you can probably think a bit about why is the United Kingdom ranked as a more fragile state than the Republic of Ireland. So this is the most recent edition of the Fragile States Index. It's 2024. And what you're looking for there are the states shaded in red and orange, especially the states shaded in dark red. So the states shaded in dark red, they're characterized as the most fragile states in the world today. States shaded in orange would be fragile states viewed as being fairly fragile. The most stable states are those that are shaded in blue, and especially dark blue. And you can immediately there, depending on how good your eyesight is, you can immediately pick out a number of states there. So you've got Canada, New Zealand and Australia. In Europe then there's the rest of these very stable states are to be found in Europe, and particularly Northern Europe and Western Europe. So you're picking out there Finland, Norway, Iceland, Austria, I think Switzerland is there as well, and let's not forget the Republic of Ireland. So these states would be ranked as the 10 most stable states effectively in the world today. So there's a big difference between the most stable states and the most fragile states. What parts of the world are the most fragile states located in? There's a few exceptions, but by and large, you're looking at Africa, or particularly Saharan Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East. There's one or two exceptions to that rule. I think that's Burma there in Southeast Asia. But by and large, nearly all of the world's most fragile states are located in distinct regions across the world, namely Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East. So you're picking out their states like, if you can see there, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Chad, Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, I think as well, would be there as well. So yeah, there's a fairly... Now, states can change their position in the Fragile States Index. If a state is doing okay and then suddenly something happens and a civil war breaks out in that state, that state's position will decline quite rapidly. On the other hand, in some cases, states are being kind of undergoing prolonged periods of civil war. The civil war might end and a degree of cohesion may be established in that state. So for instance, the states in West Africa, Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire, these were states that were, and Liberia, these were states that were undergoing a significant degree of civil war and the knock-on effects of civil war in the early 2000s. And these states would have ranked fairly high on the Fragile States Index, but there's been a pretty notable degree of improvement in that part of Africa over the last 10 or 20 years. So the general consensus is things are getting worse globally in the last 5-10 years in terms of world politics and the shape of world politics. But there are some regions where the level of state fragility has declined quite a bit, which is good to see. So as I said, West Africa is probably this, that part of West Africa there, the bulge there, which includes places like Cote d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast, Sierra Leone, or Liberia. There has been improvement in that region over the last 10 to 20 years. So this is not the most recent, this is 2019, but unfortunately things don't change that much. So this is kind of just allowing you to pick out some of the countries that rank very high and very high in terms of the Fragile States Index. So there you can see in Southeast Asia, Myanmar, I call it Burma. The official title is now Myanmar. I need to catch up with the way the world is operating. So Myanmar, formerly Burma, Afghanistan, and in the Middle East, then you've got Syria and Yemen. In Africa, then, or sub-Saharan Africa, Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, Democratic Republic of Congo, a huge, Sudan and Democratic Republic of Congo, both huge countries. Also Chad, and that country, the one I didn't mention, CAR, the Central African Republic. So these would be ranked as the most fragile states across the world today. If you look at Europe there, I'll come back to Europe in a minute, but if you look at Europe, it's interesting. You can see there is, by and large, a distinction between Western and Northern Europe and other parts of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, in terms of the levels of state stability and state fragility. Well, I'll talk about that in the next slide. So there, as I say, there's the geography of fragile states. So most of the world's most fragile states, they're located in this part of the world. Large parts of Africa, with the exception of this parts of southern Africa, with the exception of parts of northern rather northwest Africa. Libya is quite high for obvious reasons. The Middle East, then, so really picking out there, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, and so on. This is the most recent edition of the index. So this is how countries ranked in the most recent. The most fragile state in 2024 was Somalia, which has hit that. It's finished first in the Fragile States Index on a number of occasions in the last 10 or 20 years. Followed by Sudan, South Sudan, then Syria, then the Democratic Republic of Congo, Yemen, Afghanistan, the Central African Republic. Now, one state that we didn't pull out there because it's in entirely different part of the world, in Central America, Haiti, which, and then Chad makes up, and Myanmar or Burma, Ethiopia, Palestine, Mali, Nigeria, Libya, then coming after that. But you can see those names for yourself. So yeah, by and large, with the exception of Haiti at number 9, nearly all these states, and Myanmar or Burma number 11, nearly all of these states are located either in the Middle East or in Africa. Here's the most stable, the fragile states, a different way of looking at it. You might be able to see, this is the most stable states. Now, it's hard to see here. I'm even struggling here, but you might see it better if you've got the full screen on. So most stable or the most sustainable states in the world today. The most sustainable state in the world today, according to the Fragile States Index, is Norway, followed by Finland, followed by Iceland, and then Denmark. So there's a very obvious cluster in Scandinavia there. Sweden, funnily enough, is a little bit lower. The next fifth highest then is New Zealand. Number 6 is Switzerland, and then joint seventh is Canada and Ireland, followed by Luxembourg in 8th, then the Netherlands, and then that is Australia. So they're the top 10. Now, if you look at Ireland, you'll see that Ireland is ranked pretty high. So Ireland is generally viewed as one of the most stable or sustainable states in the world today, based on the Fragile States Index, the Republic of Ireland. 10 years ago, Ireland was still fairly high but Ireland was in a much lower position during the economic recession and all the political and social ramifications of that recession. But definitely in the last 5-6 years, Ireland's position was once again improved in relation to the Fragile States Index. Ireland is obviously ranking higher than a lot of other countries, including the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom is some distance behind Ireland in terms of the Fragile States Index. Now, you might think about this. Why is the UK ranked lower than Ireland? Well, the UK has one thing Ireland doesn't have, and that's a large number of people who would actually prefer not to be part of the United Kingdom. So there is a stronger degree of cohesion, of state legitimacy in the Republic of Ireland. We don't have any separatist movements. Like people in Cork might rant on about, Cork's the true capital by, we want our own state, but they don't really want their own state. I think people in Niche, to be honest, would do very well with their own mini state, but I'm just being biased there. Whereas in the United Kingdom, there is a hint of an independence movement in Wales. We talked about this in the last 2 lectures, that maybe cultural nationalism is a bit stronger than political nationalism in Wales at the moment, but there are still a number of Welsh people who would like an independent Wales. There's a stronger independence movement in Scotland, probably about 40%, 45%, maybe sometimes even close to 50% of the people in Scotland would prefer to break away and create an independent Scotland. And then Northern Ireland, a significant chunk or proportion of the population there might prefer to see Northern Ireland break away and maybe reunite with the Republic of Ireland. So that's a big difference there. So you'll see places like France where you have a Corsican independence movement, there's Spain, Catalonia, the Basque region, etc. So that's why those states tend to rank much lower. A lot of the states as well that rank as the very highest tend to be states that are generally, they might be politically neutral, but they're generally states that don't get engaged in wars with other states as well. So that's another factor. Oh yeah, so there you are now. You can see more clearly how the different states rank. I zoned in on this a bit more. So you can see Ireland has a score of 18.6, and Ireland is ranked joint 172nd, or as I said, joint 7th in terms of the most stable state. United Kingdom, which is at the top of the next column, is a good distance behind the Republic of Ireland in terms of its score and its ranking. Now, why do we get so many fragile states in the developing world? I think there's a lot, obviously economic conditions, there's a lot of reasons, a lot of factors at play here. Obviously economic reasons are a factor. These states are less developed than other parts of the world. And where you get a higher degree of underdevelopment, conflicts over things like valuable environmental resources, so diamonds, oil, there's more scope for conflicts over environmental resources and other things such as culture, religion, and so on. The one thing I will say, and this is to try and link in with last week's lecture, that one thing you will note about a lot of the states in parts of Africa and parts of the Middle East is they're actually relatively new states. A number of these states didn't emerge until the period of decolonization in the 1950s, 1960s, and even the 1970s. So one of the first points to note really is they're relatively new states. And if you go back to Bourdieu's definition suggests that the emergence of a modern state takes place, it's a process, so it takes place over a period of time. So the stable states we see in Finland, Norway, Denmark, many of those states have taken shape over a long period of time, whereas some of the states in parts of Africa and the Middle East may be states that only came to existence in the 1960s and 1970s. And you've got the knock-on effects of colonialism as well. Like, some of these are nominal democracies, but ultimately the group that effectively gained control of the state in the wake of independence, sometimes the person or the groups that gained independence, they're able to more or less, by various means, keep that level of control over the state. And if that control is ever challenged, usually you're looking at a conflict situation. The last point I'll note is, and I should have pinned down on this, if you look back at the map of Africa, you'll notice there's a lot of states with straight line boundaries. Now, we don't get straight line state boundaries in Europe, because the boundaries between countries like Switzerland and France, between Spain and France, the boundaries between those states have taken shape over a long period of time, over centuries, and they tend to be a bit strange at times. You look at the borders of Switzerland, so you get a lot of squiggly lines in that, but straight lines suggest one thing, that suggests these lines are artificial. And where do these straight line boundaries come, particularly in relation to Africa? Ultimately, they all relate back to the colonization of Africa. Now, you will know from your history that European empires controlled large parts of the world outside of Europe, mainly the Americas in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. Africa was actually the last continent to be colonized by the European powers. And this took place over a very short period of time in the late 1800s. So a lot of what you see today in terms of state boundaries in Africa, a lot of those are effectively the boundaries that were drawn up by European powers at the Congress of Berlin in 1884. And these boundaries were inherited by the newly independent African states then in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. And these boundaries they're meaningless. They're just literally random straight lines drawn up, say, between France and the United Kingdom, say, in the late 1800s, or between France and Germany, to kind of decide which parts of Africa they would colonize. But they're being carried forward into the present date. And the knock-on effects is they're lines that are randomly drawn. Various tribal groups, ethnic groups, cultural groups, they tend to find themselves split by these lines. They tend to find themselves on the wrong sides of that. So parts of one tribe will be in one state, a part of another tribe in another state. So these were lines that were drawn with no real concern for the ethnic or cultural geographies of Africa and indeed parts of Asia when these lines were being drawn up effectively randomly in the late 1800s. So the inheritance of these state boundary lines is also another factor here, probably sparking a greater propensity for interstate conflict, but also a greater propensity for civil war. So the last few slides in this section, there's a few quotes there looking at the different states that have been ranked as the most fragile states in recent the fragile state ranking. So Yemen, first of all, 2019. You can see some of the reasons why Yemen was ranked at the top in 2019. So there's reference there to its civil war, which is still ongoing, the humanitarian crisis, which is still ongoing. So the country that finished top of the Fragile States Index in 2018 was South Sudan, which you might remember I said already is the newest state in the world. So in a way, you're also sort of seeing here a tendency for the states that tend to be ranked highest on the Fragile State Index. Most of these states are states that have only been in existence since the 1950s and 1960s, and South Sudan is an extreme example of this. It's the world's newest state. It's only came into existence probably about a decade ago. You can correct me on this. So again, you'll see from the quote there from the Fragile or the Fund for Peace website, all the different characteristics they associate with South Sudan being a fragile state in 2018. Ongoing internal conflict, lack of state legitimacy, suspended elections, and economic problems, food insecurity. Now, the country that finished top of the Fragile States Index in 2023 was Sudan. South Sudan had formerly been part of Sudan. And this country once again got propelled to the top of the Fragile State Index in 2023 when another phase in the ongoing civil war in Sudan kicked off in April of that year. And now they say that the recent coup or recent outbreak of civil war wasn't actually captured in that year's Fragile State Index, but basically they see as yet again an ongoing trend in terms of Sudan's ongoing internal problems, which have more or less, since I started lecturing it back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, Sudan has definitely been a country that's been consistently ranked as being one of the highest, most fragile states in the world with ongoing civil war. Back then it was South Sudan. You also had Darfur in the west of Sudan. So there's been an ongoing, Sudan's been exposed to ongoing civil conflict for the last few decades. Now, the country ranked as the most fragile state in the most recent Fragile States Index was Somalia. And as it says there, literally, it's either been top or second in the Fragile States Index, more or less since 2008. It's the Fragile State score for Somalia was, as it says there, was highest in 2011, 2012, in the middle of a more violent phase of the civil conflict in Somalia in that year. At one point, the central government in Somalia was estimated probably just controlled. It wasn't a case of just controlling the capital city, Mogadishu. At one stage, the central government only controlled part of Mogadishu. So, at various phases in Somalia's history over the last few decades, parts of the country have been controlled by different warring factions. Interestingly enough, in the very north of Somalia is a de facto state called Somaliland. And that territory has been more or less effectively governed by the peoples of Somaliland, more or less for the last few decades, and effectively governed. So in a way, Somaliland is still, in terms of international law, Somaliland is still viewed as part of the larger state of Somalia, but it's acting and behaving like a real state to a large degree. So Somaliland is a very good example of what we're going to talk about next, a de facto state, where even though that territory is viewed as being part of a larger state, even from the mindset of international relations, of the United Nations, effectively de facto states are being governed effectively by the people of that territory. And they're carrying nearly all or most of the characteristics we would normally expect to be associated with a full-blown state. The only things these territories are lacking in a lot of cases is international recognition. So part of Somalia is Somaliland. So obviously, as of now, the government of Somalia still doesn't have full control over all the state territory of Somalia. Somaliland might be an interesting one to look at because there has been rumors that the USA might, with under the Trump administration, the USA might push for the international recognition of Somaliland. Now, whether that'll be accepted or blocked by other countries in the United Nations Security Council, particularly China and Russia, remains to be seen. But Somaliland might very well emerge as the newest state in the world in a few years' time. And based on current conditions in Somaliland, Somaliland might be better placed to thrive to thrive as an independent state than, say, South Sudan was when that emerged as a new state roughly a decade ago. And that neatly and nicely links us into the next part of today's lecture. So we're now going to talk about de facto states. So the first half of the lecture, we've been talking about fragile states. These are states that are officially recognized as states, but they're not fully functioning as states based on what we expected of states. Based on what we expect of states, following on our discussions last week, following on what we saw in the different definitions of a state, particularly Weber's definition, Bourdieu's definition. De facto states, by contrast, are territories where territories are officially recognized as being part of a larger state, but these territories have broken away from that larger state, and the people of that territory have effective military control and political control of that territory. As I said already, to a large degree, these territories have all the characteristics you would expect or associate with a state. So effective control of the territory. They might have already established a fairly effective political system, economic system, and so on. So in terms of what we expect of a state, these territories are acting like fully blown states. The only thing they're lacking is the international diplomacy dimension. All they're missing is international recognition. So there's a number of these territories around the world today. As I say, they're officially recognized as being part of another larger state, but the territory itself has effectively broken away from the large. So you can think of the larger state as being a fragile state, and this territory within that larger state or larger fragile state, this territory is the territory of a de facto state. So the group controlling the territory effectively controls it in military, economic, and political terms. It's acting like a state, it looks like a state. I'm always sounding like Louis Walsh there. It's acting like a state, it looks like a state. All it lacks is international recognition. So as I say, de facto states, sometimes referred to as partially recognized countries, they do not enjoy worldwide diplomatic recognition. Now, there's various levels here. Some of these de facto states have no international recognition at all. Some de facto states are recognized by a small number of countries. Some are recognized by a larger number of countries, and we'll see different examples today. Some de facto states are recognized by most members of the United Nations, and in these cases, these states often will actually attain the level of United Nations membership. Again, I'll say that. Now, when you're a de facto state, as I say, you don't have international recognition. So territories that are de facto states are a lot more vulnerable to attack than territories that are the territories of full-blown, fully recognized states. Because if you're a full-blown, fully recognized states, in theory at least, being a member of the United Nations guarantees you protections. If you're a de facto state, you're in a very vulnerable position. You're always likely to be attacked by the larger state of which you're a part. And the larger state will just say, this is no, there'll be no, in a lot of cases, there won't be any opposition to this, because the larger state will just say, look, in legal terms, we're just re-establishing our control over all our state territory. So these facto states can be de facto states can be very vulnerable entities, and some de facto states will emerge, and then things will happen. The trajectory or the direction of a civil war within the larger state will change, and suddenly that de facto state can disappear as quickly as it was established. So if you look at, say, the wars in the former Yugoslavia, there was a number of de facto states emerged at different points. In the wars in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, in Croatia and Bosnia, there was various Serb de facto states. There was the Krajina region in southwest Croatia, for instance. There was the Bihać pocket in Bosnia, which actually was controlled by a breakaway Muslim group. So there's all these various de facto states. But once, as the direction of the war changed, all these de facto states very quickly disappeared when the Croat government retook the territory or the Bosnian government retook the territory. Another recent example of a de facto state that has disappeared off the map is Nagorno-Karabakh, formerly part of Azerbaijan, more or less between the 1990s and 2021, 2022. Nagorno-Karabakh, which was a territory in Azerbaijan that was largely populated by ethnic Armenians, Nagorno-Karabakh had existed as a de facto state for roughly about 3 decades, until eventually the Azerbaijan government, effectively the government of Azerbaijan, retook that territory literally over the last few years. So here's territories that are not recognized as states. So Nagorno-Karabakh, I've starred there, it was a de facto state, as I said, more or less from the early 1990s up until a few years ago. And that was viewed officially as part of Azerbaijan, but largely this was a self-governed territory governed by ethnic Armenians, more or less until the point in time where the Azerbaijan army retook the territory in the early 2020s. And the knock-on effect of that was you did have a mass out-migration of Armenians from that region back into the state of Armenia. So there was a form of, it could be argued, ethnic cleansing there. Other examples, Transnistria, which is part of Moldova. I don't know if any of you are following current affairs in Eastern Europe, you've probably heard about Transnistria. It's the eastern part of Moldova, but the population there is largely ethnic Russians, and this territory has more or less been separated from the rest of Moldova, more or less since the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Somaliland, in the north of Somalia, and there's an interesting cultural background here. I think, I could be wrong here, in terms of the makeup of the present-day state of Somalia, most of that territory had been part of the British Empire, but Somaliland, I think, was governed by Italy. So there's different cultural backgrounds to these territories, or different colonial histories for these territories. So Somaliland is in the north of Somalia. It's more or less broken away very effectively from the rest of Somalia. And as a territory, it's been a very peaceful, effectively governed territory for a number of decades now. But this territory, as of now, or as of recently, has no international recognition. Probably at this stage, the territory de facto state is most likely to become a full-blown, fully recognized sovereign state in the future, I would say. So keep an eye out for Somaliland. States that have limited recognition. So these are de facto states that have limited recognition. These are instances where maybe only one other state recognizes the territory as independent, or a small number of countries recognize the territory as independent. So examples here, North Cyprus, I think generally only Turkey recognizes that territory as being an independent entity. Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Georgia, I'll talk about those later on. Palestine, Taiwan, Kosovo. Now, Kosovo, actually, I'll show you the map later. There's various. So Abkhazia and South Ossetia are recognized by maybe about, I think the last count, 5 or 6 states. Actually, probably have lost one of those states. One of those states that was recognized in these territories was Syria, but there's been political change in Syria in the last year or so. So Syria may withdraw that recognition also. Palestine, a number of states around the world, probably, I don't know, I should double check this, but maybe 30, 40 states, roughly that ballpark, maybe a few more in the last year or so. Roughly about 30, 40 states recognized Palestine as an independent state. Taiwan is recognized by a small number of countries as an independent state. Kosovo is recognized by quite a large number of countries, probably about 70 or 80 at the last count. And I'll talk about Kosovo again later on. Western Sahara, which is officially part of Morocco, but again, another example of a de facto state. There's a few countries as well, or states around the world, that are officially members of the United Nations, but they're not recognized by every country around the world. So Israel does not have diplomatic relations with roughly about 30-something states around the world. This was back in, when I last checked this was in the early 2020s. And some of those, there's been a bit of a change. So some of the states some of the Gulf states, so the United Arab Emirates and so on, have now established diplomatic relations. So you're probably looking at 31 countries at the moment. Cyprus isn't recognized by Turkey, and Mongolia and China are not recognized as independent states by Taiwan. So here's a few examples of them. So down there, if you look at the west there, you'll see the very first, moving across from the left of the screen, you've got Kosovo, which is located in the Balkan region. That's the pink area there. Formally recognized as part of Serbia by a number of states around the world still today. A large number of states, particularly Islamic states and Western states, recognize Kosovo as an independent. Transnistria, just up to the northeast of Moldova. You'll see it there at the top of the screen. That little thin sliver of pink there at the top of the screen, just bordering on the Black Sea. That's Transnistria. Moving a bit further southeast, you see a few territories there highlighted in red. So first of all, in Georgia, you have South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Then moving further south, you have the former de facto state territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, which has now been subsumed fully back into Azerbaijan. And then at the very bottom of the map, in Cyprus, you've got North Cyprus. North Cyprus is the part of the island of Cyprus that's highlighted in pink. And then you've got Israel and Palestine at the bottom of the map. So is Kosovo a state? So here's the current state of play in terms of the recognition of Kosovo. A large number of Islamic countries recognize the independence of Kosovo. Most Western countries recognize the independence of Kosovo. Western countries, but not. There are some countries that don't. So Slovakia is one, but one of the big exceptions here is Spain. Spain doesn't recognize the independence of Kosovo. And there are certain political reasons for that. So Kosovo is the last, depending on your viewpoint here, and in terms of the diplomatic relations or the international relations viewpoint of the Republic of Ireland, Kosovo is viewed as a state. So the Republic of Ireland recognizes Kosovo as an independent state, as does most of the members of the European Union. Kosovo emerged out of the wars in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. It was the very last phase of those wars in the 1990s. It effectively was, before the wars ended, it was effectively part of the state, or was then the Republic of Serbia. But effectively, at the end of the war in 1999, where NATO intervened to support the Kosovo Albanians in a civil war with Serbia, effectively it broke away from Serbia at the end of that war in 1999. Almost 10 years later, or 9 years later, there was an independence referendum, and Kosovo declared itself an independent state. And the independence of Kosovo was recognized by most Western countries and a large number of Islamic countries. There were some exceptions. Spain does not recognize the independence of Kosovo. The reason for that is because Spain is worried about a domino effect. So Spain will say, in the mindset of the Spanish government, if we recognize Kosovo, then people in Catalonia and the Basque region will say, okay, you're recognizing the independence of Kosovo, so now you can do the same for us, and let us break away. So Spain is worried about a spillover effect in its own state territory. Within Kosovo itself, there's still a large number of Serbs living in the north of Kosovo who don't recognize the new state. And there's always potential that this territory in North Kosovo may try to break away from the rest of Kosovo. Some would argue as well that, okay, why does Kosovo exist as an independent state? Does it exist because Kosovo itself effectively governs the territory? Kosovo has full military control of the territory. Some suggest it only exists because it's protected by the European Union and the United Nations and still needs a lot of support from these bodies to exist. Now, the funny thing about Kosovo is, if you look at sporting cultural events, Kosovo participates in some events, it doesn't participate in other events. So there's different rules for different major sporting events, cultural events, about which countries are allowed to take part, which countries are not. So for an event like the Eurovision Song Contest, you need to be fully recognized as a state to be allowed to take part in that contest. You need to have your local broadcaster recognized as a broadcaster that's representing the interests of a fully blown independent state. The problem for Kosovo at the moment is a large number of countries recognize the independence of Kosovo, but a large number of countries in Europe also do not recognize the independence of Kosovo. Obviously, Serbia is one of those countries. Russia is one of those countries. A lot of the countries in the former Soviet bloc wouldn't recognize the independence of Kosovo. Kosovo, however, is allowed to take part in international soccer contests such as the European Championships and the World Cup. And soccer fans will know Kosovo is in the World Cup playoffs like the Republic of Ireland is, and Kosovo also takes part in the Olympics. Now, are South Ossetia and Abkhazia states? This is an interesting one. So, just to recap in Kosovo, we saw roughly about 80, 90, almost half the countries around the world today recognize the independence of Kosovo. It still hasn't yet attained full membership of the United Nations, in part because over half the members of the United Nations still don't fully recognize the independence of Kosovo. But the main block to Kosovo being recognized as an independent state is Russia. Russia is one of the 5 members the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. And ultimately, for a state to be fully recognized as a member state of the United Nations, obviously it would help if you get recognized by most states in the United Nations, most of the United Nations member states. But the main block often is the attitudes of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Or you could actually say the attitudes of the 3 most significant, most influential states, the USA, China, and Russia. Probably in terms of the other 2 members, the United Kingdom and France, whatever way Russia, the USA will go, they'll probably go as well. So the problem for Kosovo is really down to Russia refusing to accept or recognize the independence of Kosovo. There's ethnic, religious reasons for this. There's close cultural ties between Russia and Serbia. They're both Orthodox states. So there's always been close political and cultural ties between Russia and Serbia. Close political and cultural ties that ultimately, well over 100 years ago, led to the outbreak of World War I. So there's kind of a long history there. Now, South Ossetia and Abkhazia are interesting because these are the counterexample to Kosovo. This is an example of states that Russia recognizes as, of de facto states, sorry. This is an example of de facto states that Russia recognizes as independent states, but the West and the USA does not recognize as being independent. So, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, just to give you a brief history, the Soviet Union, Georgia, which is now an independent state, Georgia, along with 15 other republics, were part of the Soviet Union more or less up until 1991. In 1991, the Soviet Union all of a sudden dissolved into 15 independent states. And some states were better placed to, namely the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Some states were better equipped to becoming independent states than others were. Georgia faced a number of internal problems in the first years of its existence, and in the first few years of Georgia's existence in the early 1990s, two regions in the north of Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, broke away and effectively became de facto states. The Ossetians and Abkhazians have effectively managed to maintain effective control of these territories more or less since the early 1990s. But they have been able to do so largely because they've got military support from Russia. South Ossetia held an independence referendum in 2006. Obviously, that referendum was passed, but no other country at that point in time recognized the independence of South Ossetia. Now, things changed in 2008. This was during the Beijing Olympics. So this was all happening while the Beijing Olympics was taking place. It was almost like the Olympics was kind of like a smokescreen that probably ensured that a lot of people wouldn't be paying attention to what was happening in Georgia. In August 2008, Georgia tried to regain its military control of South Ossetia. The knock-on effect of this was Russia intervened, and Russia actually invaded Georgia in order to maintain the independence of South Ossetia. And ultimately, the Russian military action was successful. South Ossetia retained its position as a de facto state, and the Georgian action wasn't successful. In the weeks after the conflict in Georgia, the Russian invasion of Georgia, Russia announced that it would unilaterally recognize the independence of both South Ossetia and Abkhazia. As of now, very few other countries around the world have also done so. The last I checked, I just had a quick check, Syria was one of those states, but I think Syria, this was when Bashar al-Assad was president of Syria, when Syria had very close political ties with Russia. With the change of leadership in Syria, I would suspect Syria might withdraw that recognition. Nicaragua is one of the small number of countries, Venezuela, so left-leaning countries in South America, Central America, that have close political ties with Russia. So 4 or 5 other countries today recognize the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. In the view of the West, they say, look, in the view of the West, governments in the West, including the Republic of Ireland, South Ossetia and Abkhazia are viewed as being officially part of Georgia. Now, the question is, what is the difference between South Ossetia and Abkhazia's claims to independence to those of Kosovo? If we look at it in kind of purely technical terms, are these de facto states? Does the groups controlling these de facto, have they effective control of those states of those territories. Sorry. In the case of Kosovo, you could say yes, but there is that little disclaimer there, like with people saying, well, yes, Kosovo controls the territory in effective terms, but doesn't Kosovo need the support of the United Nations and European Union to maintain that effective control? South Ossetia and Abkhazia, you could largely argue, are effectively controlled by the local people, the Ossetians and the Abkhazians. So what is the big difference between the two? The big difference is probably politics. It's probably to do with the fact that Kosovo is strongly supported by the West, so you get nearly all the Western European countries, apart from Spain. You've got Canada, USA, Australia. You get all the Western countries recognizing Kosovo. You get strong support for Kosovo also from the Islamic world as well, because the people of Kosovo are Muslim. South Ossetia, Abkhazia, on the other hand, they're supported by Russia, so it's governments in the West will not recognize the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Now, Catalonia. Is Catalonia a state? I'll just give you the answer very quickly, guys. Catalonia is obviously not a state, it's formerly part of Spain. Catalonia isn't even a de facto state because the Catalans do not have effective control of the territory of Catalonia. That territory is still effectively controlled by the Spanish government. So Catalonia is not a state. Catalonia is not a de facto state. So Catalonia has been part of Spain for centuries, but Catalonia has always existed as a separate cultural entity. It's always been very different to the rest of Spain. And there's always been this resistance to kind of becoming part of Spain. So the processes of Spanish nation building have largely been resisted by people in the Catalonia region. There was repression of the region by Franco. During the Spanish Civil War, Catalonia was on the Republican side in the expectation that if the Republicans had won the Civil War, Catalonia could have well just broke away from Spain after the Civil War. Catalonia lost in the Civil War and the right-wing dictator Franco repressed Catalonia. But once after the death of Franco, and when a new government, democratic government, was brought in, you start to see more and more local powers, more and more autonomy being given to the region of Catalonia. In 2006, Catalonia was recognized as a nation within Spain. However, this decision was overturned 4 years later by the Spanish Constitutional Court. The impact of the economic recession. I've talked about this in other parts of the module in relation to the Republic of Ireland in the late 2000s, 2007, 2008. A number of European countries were very badly hit by the economic recession that started in 2007, 2008, mainly Ireland, the old traditional, in the old European Union, the 16-country European Union, the 5 countries that had been the economic laggards in the old European Union in the 1980s and 1990s. Ireland, Spain, Italy, Portugal and Greece. These were the countries that were most badly hit by the economic recession in 2007, 2008. One part of Spain that didn't particularly suffer during this recession, however, was Catalonia, because Catalonia is by far the economic powerhouse of Spain. And Catalans started to realise that there's always been a trend that a lot more tax moves out of Catalonia than comes into Catalonia, because, as I said, it is the industrial and economic powerhouse of Spain by and large. The biggest city in Catalonia, just in case you don't know, you probably know this, is Barcelona. So it's the second largest city in Spain. So Catalonia actually did fairly okay during the recessionary period. But the knock-on effect of this was that more and more taxation, more and more funds were being moved out of Catalonia to help the more impoverished regions of Spain. So this started to increase demands for independence in Catalonia. Say, a lot of people in Catalonia were saying, why is all our money going to the rest of Spain? We'd be much better off if we were an independent state. Now, in October 2017, an unofficial independence referendum was held in Catalonia. Now, what I mean by unofficial, just to put in context, in 2014, there was an independence referendum for Scotland. Now, that was viewed as an official because the British government allowed that to take place, and they said they would accept the results no matter what happened. The independence referendum in Catalonia in October 2017 was not recognised by the Spanish. The Spanish government said, no, we're not going to recognise this. You should not be doing this. Don't do this. The independence referendum took place. It was passed by a very large majority. Some people in Catalonia, in fairness, did abstain, didn't turn out to vote in the referendum. So what the real result would have been is hard to say. But the referendum was passed. But the Spanish government immediately said, look, we're not recognising this. This is an illegal vote, and very swiftly actually arrested all the independence leaders in Catalonia and very quickly put an end to the momentum that was built up, that was trying to be built up behind the Catalan independence movement. And no other government stepped in to say, no, this is wrong. We think Catalonia should be independent. We will recognise the independence of Catalonia. So very quickly, the Spanish government reasserted its military and political control over Catalonia. So as I said, Spain still effectively controls the territory. No other state recognises Catalonia as independent. And as I said already, is Catalonia even a de facto state? It's not, because the Catalans don't have effective military or political control over the territory of Catalonia. So the last question I'm going to leave you with this today, and I'll move on to this at the next lecture, is how do you become a state? Who or what determines when a de facto state becomes a fully blown independent state? Who or what determines when a de facto state is forced to remain as a de facto state? And as I said already, when I referred to the cases in the former Yugoslavia and Nagorno-Karabakh, remaining as a de facto state leaves you in a very vulnerable position because you don't have the protection of diplomatic relations, you don't have the protection of international recognition, you don't have the protections that you would get if you were a member of the United Nations. So Krasner says, sovereignty is the ultimate goal in international relations. All de facto states want to become sovereign states. They want to become full-blown independent states. But it is not an objective term. Some territories, if you look at the facts and figures, might have more claims to be accepted as an independent state, but they're not because they don't have friends in high places. Increasingly, sovereignty is awarded and defined by powerful actors whose interests are at stake. And ultimately, decisions on whether a de facto state becomes a fully blown independent state, a lot of those decisions are made by the superpowers, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So to become a member of the United Nations, ultimately, to be honest, it depends on the attitude of the 5 permanent members, or more specifically, the United States of America, China, and Russia. So states that do manage to become members of the United Nations, generally they will need the support of all the members of the United Nations Security Council. Or if they're not getting the outright support of these members, they at least want these 5 permanent members of the Security Council to be largely indifferent, to not really care that much. So when South Sudan was recognized as an independent state, generally no one really opposed that in the United Nations Security Council, because none of the permanent members had particularly strong relationships with that particular region at that time. The most recent European country to become a full-blown independent state was Montenegro, which was part of the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, then remained linked with Serbia up until 2006. And then they had the row, did a bit of a row. Montenegro decided they wanted to go independent. And it looked as if Serbia might resist this, and then they had the row over the Eurovision selection. And then Serbia more or less, the Serbs more or less said, you know what, lads, you want to go? That's okay, you go. And Russia looked at Serbia and said, you don't care about this? And Serbia said, we don't care. The Western governments were happy enough to recognize the independence of Montenegro. So, because no one in the Security Council of the United Nations cared enough to block Montenegro's independence claims, Montenegro was very quickly accepted as a newly independent state in 2006. And 2 new states were actually created, because what was then Serbia and Montenegro became 2 new independent states. I should have said Serbia was the other new independent state, Montenegro and Serbia. Montenegro and Serbia were both independent states in the lead up to World War I, so there is a history there as well, of course, which helps. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is what do you do after you become an independent state, because you're still in a vulnerable position. Once you become a new member state of the United Nations, a full-blown independent state, you need to manifest your statehood very quickly. You need to get to advertise the fact that you're an independent state, not just to your people in your own country, which is part of the process, but you need to advertise this to other states around the world. And there's various mechanisms you can use to do that. And usually the best way to do that is to become part of major global sporting events, global cultural events. So it's not enough to be just independent, to be finally an independent state. You need the rest of the world to see you as an independent state. And I'm going to talk about that in the next lecture, which, here's a little Easter egg for you guys. For those of you, this will be actually probably the last lecture that will possibly be the last lecture that I'm going to cover with you that will be appearing, where the material is going to be appearing on the January exam. So the January exam is effectively going to be based on everything we've covered from after the Halloween study break up until the next lecture, the one on nation building, nation branding, and looking at the Eurovision Song Contest as a case study. There will be 2 more lectures at the end of the module where I give you an introduction to classical geopolitics and critical geopolitics, but the content of those lectures, it will be relevant for those of you who unfortunately have to do the exam in August. But if none of you end up doing the exam in August, you probably don't need to worry too much about the last 2 lectures in the series, which I'll post at some stage next week. Anyway, I've talked enough.